For those of you who are confused, Ian's the one without the tie. It's this guy over here. Us versus them, my friend. You and I were at a baseball game last night at Yankees Stadium. Who was us and who was them?
Yeah, us. From our perspective, us lost, sadly, but what do you do?
Yeah, so I should confess this to a New York audience. I don't understand the rules of baseball at all, but I'm a Red Sox fan. I wanted to be up front. It's a public confessional. Because in our it's all right.
Enjoyed the game.
It was a great game, but in our tradition in Australia, you dance with the ones that brung you. And it was the Harvard Kennedy School in Boston who brung me to the United States in 2014. So my first experience of this strange game of yours was at Fenway Park. That's where I actually first got to know this guy, because we're both eating hot dogs at Fenway Park together. That's right. It was a good game.
It's a good game.
Yeah. Sox lost.
Sox lost.
It was bad.
I mean, the nice thing about, sort of my view of baseball, very unlike my view around this book, is that 5 minutes after the game's over, I don't really care.
That's not in the spirit of a baseball fan. There's sort of be rolling angst, for days and weeks after the game. Going back to an earlier book of yours, by the way, not Us versus Them, Ian also is the author of a book and the bon mot of the G0. So let's step outside this book just for a moment as we begin our discussion this morning and look at what else is happening in the world. There's been a tweet from Chancellor Merkel of Germany an hour ago. What did the Chancellor have to say?
She said that the United States can no longer be counted on to defend Europe.
Now, in the world of politics and diplomacy, words are bullets. This is an unusual thing for the Prime Minister, President, or Chancellor of an allied country of the United States to say. It's a big thing to say, and it's in direct response to what's occurred with the President Trump's decision on the JCPOA or the ending of the Iranian deal. Give me your thoughts on the significance of the Merkel statement, my friend.
Well, I mean, it comes the day after we congratulated them on Europe Day, so it doesn't seem nice, right?
Who in this room knew it was Europe Day yesterday, by the way? Wow.
See?
Gee.
I didn't even know it was Europe Day, to be fair, so I bet you knew.
No idea. Fairest idea. I'm flat out remembering when my own national day is, let alone when Europe Day.
I think yesterday was, probably the worst day of U.S. foreign policy, certainly in a decade, maybe much longer than that. The great thing about being the world's only true superpower is that no one else can damage you as much as you can damage yourself. That is also the really bad thing about it, and we're doing a pretty good job. We know people say that Trump is a great divider, but I mean I do actually find him in many ways a great uniter. I think that no one has brought other countries together the way Trump did with, say, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, or pulling out of UNESCO, or Asian allies with pulling out of TPP. And the Iran decision was by far the most lasting and problematic of those unilateral decisions. I am not someone who believes that the Iran deal was a great deal. And I actually thought that pressing the European allies was a useful thing to do. And in fact, it was leading to improvements on willingness of American allies to work with the United States to ensure that the Iranians would be punished even after the sunset of the deal if they decided that they were going to go ahead and develop nuclear weapons capabilities. That's a real plus. But once you've done that, then work with them. And even Mike Pompeo, who's no fan of the deal, was trying up until the last moment, till he was sent to North Korea, to get President Trump to work with the Europeans multilaterally. And Macron in the morning, same thing with his phone call. And Trump's response to the allies was basically drop dead. I think that the response that those allies are going to have to the Americans, you do need allies. And at some point, there's going to be something that we want from the Europeans that we're not going to get. There are going to be decisions the Europeans will make every day that will be based less on trust and more on their own transactionalism. And that unwind, I think, is pretty significant. So all this, I mean, I know that you're bothered by all this. All this bothers, I think it's hard to care about foreign policy. It's hard to care about the stability of the world and not be worried about the underpinnings of the most important relationship that really got us some level of global stability since World War II, which is the transatlantic relationship. And I think it's very clear that that relationship, as of today, is in its worse shape, structurally, than it has been at any point since the end of World War II.
I think that's right. I mean, with due respect to Hal Newman, who's with us this morning, I mean, a lot of politics, international politics, is a bit like a Broadway show. But some of it's real. And the beginning of wisdom in politics, international politics, is to know when something fundamental and real has occurred. And this was one of them. Why is it real? I mean, you've just mentioned North Korea. The big differentiator between what's unfolding in North Korea and what had been unfolding in Iran is that for the Europeans, they were all within rocket range of the Iranian capability. This became, therefore, an elemental concern of European collective security, what you did with the Iranian nuclear program. That's why it was the P5+1. Britain, France, together with Germany, the European Union collectively engaged in these negotiations, which went on and off for the better part of a decade in one form or another. And so in one fell swoop, you have the President of the United States just getting the rug and going, phew, there you go. I don't like Iranians. Therefore, the statement by Merkel is not just a piece of, I think, political ephemera. I do not know Merkel to have said, as a highly cautious former East German chemist, to actually engage in wild political rhetoric. That's not her nature. For her to make a statement like that, I think represents some fundamentals about German and European anger about US administration disregard for their security.
I think there are two big problems here, right? And let's be clear that Trump can get wins. And he's gotten some wins. He got a win on South Korea trade deals, gotten a win on the Brazilian trade deal. So far on North Korea, he's the guy that was able to push the Chinese to actually impose the sanctions. And you saw at 3 a.m. this morning the 3 U.S. hostages that were released. Trump deserves credit at that. But let's be clear. If you're sitting at a poker table and you have the largest stack of chips, the fact that you're willing to go all in with those chips all the time, irrespective of what your cards actually look like, you can get other players to fold to you all the time, right? You can win a lot of small pots. And that is exactly what Trump is doing. Let's be clear that while that strategy will get a lot of small wins, at some point, that strategy is likely to blow up in your face in a much bigger way. So there's a lot more risk acceptance, a lot more danger, and Iran might be where the bluff is called. We shall see. I am worried about the Iran outcome. But, you know, the Iran outcome might also work to Trump's advantage, right? It could, in terms of the transactional nature of it, because the Iranian economy is already doing badly. It is going to do a hell of a lot worse. The idea that the Europeans can maintain business dealings with the Iranians, given the secondary sanctions by the U.S., strikes me as very, very unlikely. And yes, the hardliners will be emboldened in Iran, but the people in Iran will be very upset. There will be demonstrations, and there will be more pressure. So it is conceivable in 6 months, in a year's time, that the Iranian hardliners will come back to the Americans begging bowl in hand and say, okay, we actually do need to talk to you more broadly about the missiles that threaten you that we're developing, about our willingness to, actively ramp up our proxy wars against you and your allies in the region, which we've done a lot more of since we signed the deal. I can see that happening, 10, 20, 30%. But while you're doing all of this, the damage you're doing to long-term American relations, the damage you're doing to U.S.-led architecture and values, the opening you're provided to other countries that are looking to find ways to erode the things that matter to you, most importantly China, but also Russia and other rogues. Those things are very, very significant. They're much more lasting. So we're getting these little tactical wins, and we need to recognize that those tactical wins are coming because of things that Trump is doing. But let us be very clear that American influence globally is deteriorating very quickly. It was deteriorating under Obama, and because of some things in the U.S., but a lot of things happening around the world that we could spend a lot of time talking about. We won't this morning, but it's deteriorating a lot more quickly under President Trump. And absolutely, in that regard, you can look not just at what's happened in Iran and Paris and Jerusalem and TPP. You can even look at North Korea and talk about America First being a very significant further unwind of a U.S.-led global system.
The analogy you used before about President Trump's attitude to international relations and diplomacy was poker. And that, I think, is quite an elegant analogy because if you accept the proposition that his approach to politics at home and abroad is transactional, then that fits. The problem is that the inherent reality of international relations is that it's bridge. It's complex rules, and played effectively, you actually have partners. Whereas the ground perception which the president seems to have of friends and allies is that they are problems rather than opportunities. They are limiters of American power rather than enablers of American power. If you speak to our Chinese friends privately over a few Mao Tai, late in the evening, we didn't have any Mao Tai at the game last night, but they weren't serving it at the bar. I just noticed that. The Yankee Stadium needs to become more diverse in its drinks offering. Is that the Chinese, when they look at the American phenomenal network of global alliances, the product of the Second World War, but complex diplomacy in the 40s and 50s after the war, they sort of stand back in awe at what America has constructed in terms of what they do see legitimately, objectively, and certainly in Asia, as force enablers. And so brings us back to Trump himself and his psychology. And here begins the inelegant segue to the book, having dealt with Germany and baseball. And that is Trump and the reality we now have being visited on the world at large as a product of the domestic body politic of the United States. Tom Nagorski read the line before about him being a manifestation, quoting your book, him being a manifestation of what's been going on in this country, not the creator of what's going on in this country. So for those who haven't read the book, in terms of the great domestic disruption and the division of this country, among others, between us versus them, and therefore producing political phenomena like Trump, give us the 3-minute up and down lift pitch about the argument, the core diagnostic of the book. We'll go on to prescriptions later on, but give us the diagnostics.
Sure. I mean, this was, for me, a much more personal book because it's very clear that the United States right now is more divided than any time in my lifetime. And I think none of us are happy about that. And it's happening at a time when the U.S. economy is doing really well. It's happening at a time when the global economy is doing really well. And, you know, as someone who grew up in the projects, my brother voted for Trump. My mother, if she was still alive, would have voted for Trump. They probably would have voted for Sanders, too, to be fair. But, I mean, the idea that they would support the establishment, the view was that the establishment lies, that they have lots of facts at their disposal, and they use those facts and don't really care about us. And no one's going to take care about my kids except for me and the family. And so we'll do anything. We'll lie, we'll cheat, and we'll steal to make sure that you guys have an opportunity. And that was my personal experience, but I always kind of put it in the background because I had so many opportunities growing up. And I think it's much harder to put it in the background today. So the 3-minute lift pitch.
60 seconds left.
Oh. Because that was just a little personal kind of
Yeah, it was an intro.
segue.
It was a 2-minute intro, mate. So
Oh, sorry.
we need the
I thought people cared about my personal story.
I care.
You know it already.
I care.
So, yeah,
I care.
Yeah.
Hal cares. I care.
Okay.
The others
no one
don't.
else cares. Okay, fine. That's fine. Okay, I understand. I mean, they're here on a morning, but thank you. Basically, 4 big reasons why not only the United States, but all of the advanced industrial democracies, with one major exception, are vastly more divided now than any point we've seen in decades. Number one, the obvious one, the economic one, which is that globalization creates discontents, and if you don't take care of those people, those jobs, many will disappear, many opportunities will lose. Yes, of course, free trade is great, globalization is great, it's efficient, you gain growth, but you still have to deal with the discontents. Number two, culture, and the countries feel a lot more different. You have a lot of people coming in that look different, they talk different. Historically, the U.S. has done a pretty good job of integrating people. Europeans have done a less substantial job. But if you aren't taking care of people and their families, then they're not so interested in bringing in others, and that backlash is very clear. Number three, defense. The United States and allies fighting wars all over the world to make the world safe for democracy, or just to make the world more stable. And of course, the people that are fighting in those wars are enlisted men and women, their families taking care of them. They come back frequently PTSD or worse, and the Veterans Administration is broken, and they're not heroes, and the wars have been failed. That's a big piece. And then finally, and most disturbingly, technology, because it's so fast. 25 years ago, technology was all about nobody on the internet knows if you're a dog, right? It was a communications revolution. It was empowering. It was Tunisia. It was Egypt. It was the Arab Spring. Today, it's not. We know if you're a dog on the internet. Today, it's all top down. It's controlled by institutions, by governments, by corporations, and it is much more empowering of those institutions and not of those people. So people get angry about that. A lot more jobs are displaced because of automation than ever were because of global trade, and also social media, the way people consume information is much more divisive, much more unraveling of liberal democracy, much more empowering of authoritarianism, and we see this with China and social credit, for example. You put those 4 things together, and it's pretty overdetermined that you're going to have an enormous backlash against globalism, with one exception in the advanced industrial democracies, and that's Japan. And Japan is really interesting because no immigration, so no one to hate. Population is shrinking, so even though it's, economy's flat, per capita income's been going up, they feel pretty good on the economic side. Military is constitutionally prescribed from fighting all these wars, so as a consequence, no one's angry about that. And you look at the homogeneity, and you look at the population shrinking, and you realize that the AI revolution actually benefits Japan, doesn't hurt them. So the one country where you don't see the failure of globalism in the West is the one country that actually never embraced globalism. And I think that tells us something that's pretty concerning. So that's the 2-minute pitch.
4.5.
Yeah.
I'll come back to the question of Japanese exceptionalism in a minute, because I think it's a fascinating point, because I'd like to explore that in the context of India. And India's pointed refusal until now, and now only partially, to embrace what we would describe as open liberal globalization. You have a nice quote here early in the book which goes to the essence of your domestic thesis. These leaders, you say, referring to Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, and even Elizabeth Warren gets wrapped into that one. These leaders, you say, aren't arguing that government should be bigger or smaller, that it should tax less or spend more. They're challenging the right of elites to make the rules that govern our lives. They tell citizens they've been cheated of their chance to succeed, and the media is not on it. They promise to comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable. You should have been a preacher. That's a nice line. And burn down the houses of power. We can attack these populists, mock them or dismiss them, but they know something important about the people they're talking to, and they understand that many people believe that globalism and globalization have failed them. It's quite a powerful paragraph. We just had last week the 200th anniversary of Karl Marx's birth. That sounds, in some respects, like a pretty dire Marxist analysis, in the sense that there is such a fundamental alienation at present on the part of a growing number of working and non-working people against the prevailing economic and social conditions, that there is a cri de coeur for a form of overthrow of the system. Now, am I taking all that too starkly, or is that kind of your analysis?
Well, I mean,
Marx is wrestling with industrial technological dynamics too, the analysis of the English Industrial Revolution in the 19th century.
Yeah. And, I mean, on the one hand, you're taking it too starkly. On the other hand, you're taking it not starkly enough. What do I mean by that? I mean, not starkly enough, but too starkly in the sense that our institutions are quite strong. They're very resilient. And so the ability that even if you elect a Trump who says drain the swamp, who says I'm going to afflict the comfortable, this is one hell of a way to afflict the comfortable, right? I mean, if you look at what he's actually doing on the domestic side, not what he's saying, but what he's doing on the domestic side, and you see the regulatory rollback, you see the judicial and the Fed appointments, you see the tax policy. I mean, this is, on the one hand, you could say tax is a gift for everybody in the short term, but the reality is that the swamp is not being drained. The swamp is, sort of very, very strong. Thank you very much.
The comfortable becoming more comfortable.
Absolutely, and I think that that the ability of our system to ignore this as a problem is much greater than I think any of us would like or feel comfortable with in terms of the kind of system we want to live in, right? On the other hand, that does mean that the kind of society we are likely to live in 10 or 20 years' time is one we are not going to be comfortable with. Because the alternative of fixing it is building much stronger walls. And that's why I think you're not bleak enough, because I think walls work. And I worry about that. My favorite quote, which I have later in the book, is by William Gibson, which is, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed." And that's why I started with Israel. Because 10 years ago, if you read Tom Friedman, his articles on Israel-Palestine all had the same basic theme, which is we have to either create a two-state solution or it's the end of Israel. That's just wrong. Right? I mean, the Israelis right now have perhaps one of the most effectively run democracies in the world. Rule of law, anti-corruption, transparency, free media, independent judiciary, you name it. That's even true for Arabs living in Israel, as long as you're not Palestinian, right? As long as you're not in the occupied territories. And the Israelis have been able to do this in part by effectively walling off the Palestinians. And when I say walling them off, I mean in so many different ways. I mean the border walls that even right now, there are these 3 cement factories that are on the Israeli side of the Gaza border, and they're building walls under the border to stop the tunnels with sensors too. I'm talking about Iron Dome, which is a kind of a wall stopping Hezbollah missiles from coming in, stopping Iranian missiles from coming in, right? You saw over the Golan just in the past 24 hours. I'm talking about extreme vetting. Anyone that flies into Tel Aviv knows what real extreme vetting is. If you're not who you say you are, doing what you say you're going to do in Israel, you're not getting in. Very different story than the United States or Europe. All of these things. But I'm also talking about a process of dehumanizing Palestinians, which is really important. It's essential to the paradigm. Because you can't live in Israel today and not care about the two-state solution unless, to a degree, you're prepared to accept that Palestinians aren't really people, right? You have to, because they have none of the economic opportunities and none of the personal security opportunities and none of the educational opportunities. And we can, and you have to be able to do that, or otherwise the cognitive dissonance would be too great. You'd be saying, how can I possibly live like this and allow these people to live like that? And the thing is that Trump really gets that. He even says, you want to see how walls work? Look at Israel. And Trump is by far the ne plus ultra of us versus them leaders. I mean, Trump's willingness to say that Mexicans are prepared to come here and rape our women and criminalize our population, that Nigerians will never go back to their huts if we let them in, that Haitians are bringing AIDS, that even in the United States, how dare these black athletes, we let them make millions of dollars and then they won't even stand for our national anthem. I think that's very effective because I think it allows us to more effectively dehumanize them, to the extent that when I posted 2 weeks ago that there were 11 Syrian refugees that have been allowed into the United States so far, 11. So, I mean, I could give you their names, right? We put their pictures up. Half of the Americans responding to...
Please don't do that.
I won't, but because I don't have them with me. But half of the Americans that responded to my social media post, and I didn't comment on it, I just put it up, said, yeah, that's 11 too many. Now, that's not a country that has the Statue of Liberty, right? I mean, that's a country that has gotten more comfortable. I mean, 7 years of Syrian war with 5 million refugees can only be allowed by people who don't believe that Syrians are really people. 1 million plus Venezuelans, much closer to home, that are fleeing because they've lost, on average, over 15 pounds of weight in the last 12 months. Over 90% can't get enough food, can only be allowed if we don't really think of them as people. And I think that that's the direction we're heading, right? Especially if the fourth industrial revolution is actually not the fourth industrial revolution, but it's a post-industrial revolution where we're not going to need as many people working. Because if that's true, then suddenly the value of those people in a world where many are becoming much more technologically empowered, even in terms of lifespan and expectancy, not just in terms of the way we live, suddenly makes us think very differently about who matters and who doesn't matter.
The defining feature of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes in history is the division between people and non-people. We're acutely conscious of what the German fascists did on that question during the Second World War, where the Jewish peoples of Europe were regarded as subhuman. That was effectively the tenets of Nazi racist hatred. And in communist regimes, including Stalin's Soviet Union, you had categories of non-people, because it was only by categorizing them as non-people that you could deal with them in inhuman terms. Once you cease to be human, you can be inhuman to those who are not human. That's your thesis. It's domestic, I mean, it's a powerful set of arguments, and walls, whether they are imagined and maybe real to come between the United States and Mexico, walls as they are now physical and real between Israel and the West Bank. But you extend the analogy to a future dystopia in the United States and the collective West, whereby the whole notion of the walled residential enclave becomes the norm. That is, that the us becomes increasingly walled away from the them. And that's, for me, the disturbing bit of this. Let me return to Chelsea for a moment, where you grew up in Boston. Back in Chelsea, in my own neighbourhood, people are angry. They no longer believe that hard work and education are enough. They don't see a path, and they feel they've been lied to. This is where you go on to talk about the voting decisions of your brother. You've been back there. I mean, you know the community. Is it your analysis that it is that bad comprehensively in similar communities across the United States, that the pathways to horizontal class mobility have now disappeared or become so difficult that we begin to retreat to the, let's call it, the simmering hatred of the barricades, the throwing of rocks, to use your Palestinian analogy at the beginning of the book, and then to something more violent over time?
Well, I mean, obviously, the Palestinian analogy is a very stark one because it really resonates, especially here in New York. The United States isn't Tunisia, right? And so if people are slipping off of working or middle class, they may feel badly that their kids are not going to have the same opportunities they did. And so as a consequence, they'll vote for someone like Trump, or they won't vote at all in the most important election that we've had in our lifetimes. But they won't revolt, right? They won't turn to violence. Where in Tunisia and Egypt, when those economies suddenly went sideways on the back of the Eurozone crisis, and that's basically what happened, right? The most important trading partners, tourism partners, humanitarian aid partners, remittance partners suddenly were in crisis, and so they took it really on the chin. Then you have people who really, they lose their jobs and they could starve. And so they're willing to set themselves on fire, as we saw with that Tunisian fruit vendor, and that led to revolution. I certainly don't believe that we're close to that level of instability in the United States, but I do believe that there is that level of ennui. I do believe that there is that level of alienation from people that they think have lost legitimacy. So when 1/6 of young people, one of the most disturbing stats I see in the book, Americans a year ago polled say that they would prefer military rule in the United States to democratic elections. I don't think that's because they don't like democracy as a notion. I think it's because they believe that America is not a democracy. In other words, they actually accept the fact that, as Trump says, the system is rigged against them. My mother certainly believed that the system was rigged against us. Almost everyone I grew up in the projects would have said that. I think that was exactly what was behind the Brexit vote. A lot of people that listened to honest-to-God real facts from the Labour and Conservative leadership and from the public intellectuals and from the mainstream media and from the corporate CEOs and from the bankers, and they said, those guys with their fancy facts are using them to hurt us. And the only thing we can do is throw a rock. And maybe that's not going to make it better, but at least we will let them know that we know they're lying, that we don't give them that legitimacy. And that's where I think this plays out in the United States, that the mainstream media has been acting as if by calling out Trump on facts, because Trump gets facts wrong all the time, and he revels in it, right? I was actually on Morning Joe last week as part of the book tour. Mika and Joe right there, and right before my segment, Willie Geist on his phone goes, uh-oh, there's a Trump tweet. And it wasn't even a Trump tweet. It was a one of two Trump tweet, where he does the first half and then he goes ... So it wasn't even comprehensible with the first half. But the first 2 minutes of my book segment, they said, wait a second, we got to read this tweet, and what does it mean? And they go to Washington, they hand it off to Kelly, and then bring it back to me, and what do you think, Ian? I'm like, I think this is part of the problem.
It is,
right?
It is if you want to sell your book.
Yes. It really is. But I didn't even want to write the book, I mean, that's what it really comes down to. I'm worried that, the vast majority of people in the media today in the United States that are opposed to Trump believe that what they need to do is call Trump out on facts, and tell everyone how horrible Trump is literally all the time. And I have to, at least in this book, a fundamental argument is that there is more complicity in those of us, very much myself included, that are living in these societies and have allowed us to get to the point that so many people in our population would think that there was no purpose in voting, or that they should vote for someone like Trump or the AfD in Germany or the Northern League or the Five Star Movement in Italy, and on and on and on, or Brexit, simply because everyone else is lying to them. I think that's structural. We're going to get rid of Trump in 4 years and 8 years' time. He'll be gone. And we're not going to fix this. And someone else is going to come along. These problems are going to grow.
It strikes me as probably the most fundamentally challenging part of the analysis. In response to what I asked before, you said, look, we're not at the barricades in this country yet. But there are a whole lot of dangerous things happening out there, of which, let's call it, Trump is the first evidence of the whiff of grape shot, if you like. As an outsider, as a foreigner living in your midst, what I sense is, given Trump's brilliance at manipulating this deep sense and reality of alienation in large slabs of America, when finally the game is up and it's demonstrated that he hasn't afflicted the comfortable but made the comfortable more comfortable, what then happens with the rage of the communities like those in the projects? Where does it then go as a dynamic in American politics? I mean, I think there is almost a subliminal view in the United States that, well, at least then we'll be back to normal. Whereas my sense as an outsider is that there is a very large, potent, uncontrollable political dynamic in this country which could erupt in multiple directions in the post-Trump America.
I guess the question is, will people even think he failed? You know, I mean, Trump's willingness to continue to go after the media's fake news every day is pretty high. And a lot of people, I think, that support Trump or didn't bother to vote would accept that that is some kind of deeper truth. The deeper truth being that this media is selling you a narrative that's keeping all of them in power and is never going to help you. And at least I'm willing to be honest with you about the game. I mean, Trump is the guy that said, let's get those 2,000 troops out of Syria. I think it's amazing that enlisted men and women in the United States would vote for Trump. Think about what that says. This is by far the least patriotic president we've ever seen. 7 draft deferrals, bone spurs. McCain's not a war hero because he got caught. Gold Star families, all this stuff. And yet they're so angry that they feel like all of these Democrats and Republicans have been sending them off to fight in these failed wars. Like maybe Trump won't do that. And I do believe that Trump's inclination, and we've seen this on Afghanistan with him fighting Mattis. We've seen it with Syria. He's more than happy to send drones, do some bombing, show he's a tough guy. But he really doesn't want American troops fighting all over the world. He wants other people doing it. Wants the Europeans to pay more for defense. Doesn't really care much about NATO. It's like, well, why can't other people fight these wars? Why do we need 30,000 troops in South Korea? Why can't the South Koreans do it? And I mean, you know, Kevin and I can sit up here and talk to an educated and wealthy New York audience, and we can give you all sorts of really good reasons why the United States should be doing those things. But they don't really resonate for the people that have been on the wrong end of that. And I just think we have to come to terms with that. So I do worry that we're going to get, first of all, I worry that the Democrats are going to win the House and they're going to do impeachment, which I think will make this much worse, by the way. But I also worry that Trump will finish 1 term or 2 terms and the economy will turn south and the extraordinary budget giveaways are going to have to be clawed back because interest rates are going to go up and suddenly CEOs, God forbid the next recession, they're all going to belt tighten. I talk to CEOs across this country. Almost not one thinks that they're going to need to hire more people to make more money going forward. They all are telling me we can make a lot more money with less people in the next 10 years in virtually every sector. So, I mean, you look at those trends and you have to feel like we're going to be in a much more challenging position for the working and middle classes in the United States at the end of Trump's term. And yet I can easily see an environment where all of those Trump supporters don't blame Trump at all. And by the way, they have a point.
Let's turn to the rest of the world, because to be fair to the United States and to be fair to the President of the United States, the economic and social conditions which give rise to the Trump phenomenon and now the new sub-discipline of political science called Trumpology, which now ranks up there with sinology, I discover. You've got to try and discern the entrails of Trumpology on a given day. Let's go to the rest of the world, because the nice thing about your book, elegant thing about the book, is that it's a reflection about America, but it's a reflection about parallel dynamics around the world. There's an eloquent quote here from a European politician. It's time for a local revolution. Countries are no longer nations but markets. Borders are erased. Everyone can come to our country, and this has cut our salaries and our social protections. This dilutes our cultural identity. Who said that? That's Marine Le Pen. But it could have been said by Alternative for Deutschland, it could have been said by UKIP, it could have been sent minus the term social protections, which is the European giveaway term. It could have been said here. And it could be said in my country as well. But you go to the guts of the book and you talk about how do these dynamics, for which the central turbocharging factor is the technology revolution and its magnified, accelerated, accentuated labour displacement effect, and the inability of markets to any longer do their thing, which is to as rapidly create jobs elsewhere in other industries and other opportunities to then absorb, and usually, historically, at higher levels of income. And then you go to a series of countries. We're the Asia Society, so let's trip across quickly some thoughts that you might have on some which would fall within our geographical definition of Asia. We take the UN definition of Asia, which is Tel Aviv to Tokyo, and all points in between. We stop at the Suez Canal. Saudi Arabia, you have some interesting reflections on Mohammed bin Salman. Do you think he's correctly identified this parallel phenomenon in his own country? You raise skepticism about whether his approach is going to be too much too late.
Yeah. I mean, look, the great thing about Mohammed bin Salman is that he is one of the very few leaders in the world today that you would really say is transformative, is even revolutionary. He is trying to truly change his system to address just how dramatically they are misaligned with where the world is heading. And he's trying to do two things. He's trying to change the oil portfolio to be a diversified portfolio, and he's trying to change the oil economy to be a diversified economy, human economy. On the first, he will succeed. He will sell off a big piece of Saudi Aramco. He will bring a lot of money in. He'll invest in technology. It'll no longer be just oil and petrochem. I think Saudi Arabia will, with a lot of cash and a relatively small population, 30 million, they'll be more aligned with global forces of what's driving wealth than just all being around oil. That's really smart. In terms of diversifying the economy at home, the real economy, I just think they're too far removed from having the numbers of people that are suitably educated to be able to really make Saudi Arabia into the Emirates in 10 or 20 years' time. And the country is also far too inhospitable and lacks infrastructure to attract the numbers of the Westerners that they would need to do it for them. So in other words, I think it's too late. But I really do believe that Mohammed bin Salman's impulses, his intentions are the right ones, and we should want him to succeed. I mean, even the 1,300 princes that were held up literally at the Ritz-Carlton, which, by the way, is more money than Marriott's ever made with a property before, because they were making rack rate on literally all of those rooms. So that's never going to happen again.
Think of the demand on room service for that month, you know?
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah. I mean, the spa service apparently was included and problematically. No, and the fact that some of them were not treated well in that five-star jail is also something that, while I don't welcome, I understand that you needed anti-corruption in a very dramatic way, because you can't have over 10,000 princes spending money the way they have historically. The money's not there. So I'm glad they did that. But I just think, if you ask me, will they succeed? The answer is probably wouldn't bet on it, because it's too hard.
So, like yourself, on balance, I'm a supporter of what MBS is trying to do. He's trying to create, he's widening the tent of us and bringing a whole bunch of thems to become us in a wider social contract, a term we'll come to in a minute. Erdogan's Turkey. Give me a minute or two on that before I start heading further east.
I do love, by the way, that young people in Saudi Arabia are happy about generally what MBS is doing, women and men. And I think if you go to any country, look at that kind of stat, and that gives you a sense of, do you like them, do you not like them, right? Turkey, you can't say that about Turkey. What you can say about Turkey is a very deeply divided country, a very us versus them country, has been for a long time. We've pretended it wasn't, brought them as candidate members to the European Union. But the reality was, you had secularizers, you had Islamists, you had cosmopolitans that were well educated that wanted Turkey to be part of a global Western world, You had a lot of others that said Ataturk is actually not the best legacy for our country. And the West will take everything that is dear from us that we hold valuable. It's very clear that the Europeans helped facilitate Erdogan by never really welcoming or wanting Turkey because they were them to be a part.
So the globalizing wall was shut by the globalizers.
That's right.
And so they then went into their own definition of us, which is an Islamist us.
Yeah, and what the Germans basically did, improving that by saying, here, we'll give you money if you keep all of these undesirables. And that was the deal. And, you know, the average Turk knows exactly what that means. We're not people. We're not treated on the same level as those Europeans. And that really provided a lot of support for Erdogan. It also helps, of course, that even though he was paranoid and is, they have been out to get them. And, you know, it was a real coup. And his ability to use that coup to purge very deeply any potential enemy around him means that Turkey now is a soft authoritarian regime and is on the precipice of becoming a real authoritarian regime, different from Hungary's Orban, which is more, as he describes it, an illiberal democracy, or Kaczynski's Poland. It's their ability to let's see these next elections. They're in principle open elections. Meral Akşener is probably going to be in the second round against Erdogan and would have a possibility. You could imagine a parliament in Turkey that will be hostile towards Erdogan. Let's see how much he's actually able to steal it. But clearly, Turkey is on a Putin path. And if that is the case, then the attractiveness of globalizers for investing in Turkey is going to go down quite a bit. And this in a country that has the demographics, the education, the geography. They have so much in their favor that you'd want to be able to bet on Turkey, and yet it's going to be more challenging.
Two last questions before I go to Q&A. The first on Mother India, us versus them.
So Modi is one of these leaders also, transformative leader, and when he became, sort of when he took over in India, he I think occupied everybody's imagination as exactly what we wanted. Finally, the Indians can build infrastructure. Finally, the Indians understand what it means to be in the global economy. Finally, you have someone who's not corrupt. And truly, Modi is not corrupt. His cabinet's not corrupt. I was in India 3 weeks ago. And, I mean, even his strongest opposition don't have a shred of there's backlash, backhanders going on to his people, that sort of thing. That's a pretty impressive a couple of years in. And yet, you see authoritarian impulses. It's much harder for the media to operate freely in India today. A lot of intimidation, a lot of self-censorship. There's growing nationalism around Modi, growing anti-Muslim sentiment, growing Hindutva, growing Hindu nationalism that's supported. And there's also, when they started with the universal ID and biometrics, that was meant to be voluntary. Not anymore. Now it's everyone mandatory, have to do it. And the Indian government sees that they can create a lot of efficiency and a lot more growth if only they could cut through the bureaucracy and have the control of all the data from the top. Now, maybe Modi, because he's not corrupt, isn't going to abuse that power, especially because he's doing pretty well politically right now. Maybe he changes over time. Maybe it doesn't matter. He does a great job, but after he's served a couple of terms, maybe the next leader is not so trusted and benign with that power. But there are an increasingly large number of people in India that are saying publicly that, maybe we have too much democracy in our system. Maybe there's too much decentralization. Maybe the reason we're so far behind China is because we don't have the state-centric elements that can really pull levers and get people to move. Now, India is never going to become China. Anyone that's been there, and a lot of people in the audience have, understand that that's just not the way the culture and the system works. But there is increasingly a political impulse in India, facilitated by technology, that I think does make Western-style liberal democracy less appealing to them as a model. And that's something worth watching.
And the last question, it's very easy. 60 seconds on China.
Well, I'm obviously really interested in your take on this as well, but I think
it means 30 seconds apiece.
Okay, I mean, the interesting point on China is that for the last 30 years in the West, so many of us presumed that as they got wealthier, they would need to politically reform or they would fail. It's kind of like Israel would need to create a two-state solution or they would fail. I think that that's wrong, and I wonder if in the same way that I said Japan is able to resist this globalist backlash, I wonder if the Chinese have the only major economic system in the world that by its nature is optimized for employing inefficient labor. And if that's true, is that a real advantage structurally for the Chinese and a disadvantage for the Americans? I wonder if China is the one major economy that has the ability to use AI and big data for their advantage in promoting state-sponsored civic nationalism, while in the United States, media and Facebook and YouTube and the rest actually directly unwinds civic nationalism and silos people who are treated as objects of consumption for the biggest advertising firms in the world. That deeply concerns me, and it makes me wonder, if you ask the question, which political system is in greater need in the 21st century in structural reform, the United States and China, I think that there's a debate. And 5 years ago, you would have had to be Chomsky to say that.
If, as we turn to questions, if the central driving dynamic of us versus them is, let's call it the compounding technological revolution and the labour displacement effect that we referred to earlier, then looking briefly at Japan, India and China, it's a fascinating set of comparisons. Japan at one level, and you said this before, has never accepted what we would describe as comprehensive neoliberal globalization. There's always been a Japanese exceptionalism to that, which we would otherwise in the West just call naked protectionism, but in a whole bunch of forms, with a social infrastructure to make it work and effective as well. I wonder, given Modi's admiration for Abe and his reflections on Japan, but also his deep knowledge of his own country, whether he's also wrestling with a parallel qualified embrace of, let's call it, globalization. On the one hand, understanding you need global markets if India is to compete with China in the long term, but domestically to raise living standards and to deal with poverty. But understanding what happens with a country which in 5 years will have more people than China if you end up with 400 million people unemployed. And then the Chinese, who, when you ask young Chinese what their view of globalization is, it's always positive because they see it as opportunity. And therefore their attitude to the global dystopia we speak of here is actually quite a different one. But that is almost buttressed on the presuppositions of a Chinese political economy or a Chinese political culture which says, don't worry, comrades, there are always going to be some very well-defined limits around this. And if you want a case study, I think, in terms of Xi Jinping's reflection on the next wave of domestic liberal economic reforms, that's gone slower, and a big decision to retain a large slab of activity in the economy for state-owned enterprises as part of an insurance premium against disruptions in the labour force driven by technology, which he and the rest of them are anticipating. Questions from the audience? There's a forest of questions. Can I go to, and I'm going for gender balance here, and I've suddenly got 6 male hands in the air, so this becomes difficult. Folks, but I'll go from here, front, and then I'm going to go to Lulu. Yeah. Over here, sorry. Sorry about that.
Hi, Stuart Beck from China Simplified. You mentioned CEO's inclination to look to AI and robotics rather than new workers, and the quote from the book about the UN feeling that 2/3 of all developed market jobs are in danger. So my question is, in this polarized us versus them world, how can we possibly reach a consensus to start working towards a solution in that area?
I mean, when I wrote this book, I felt a little bit like I was writing about climate change 30 years ago, right? When the science was there, people that were studying it understood what the problems were. But we're talking about something that's kind of in the future. It's a really big and hairy problem, and it's going to be massively expensive to deal with, and the governments don't want to take it on, right? Especially because it's going to really hit like poor, displaced people first anyway. So the idea that you were going to get governments to suddenly say, okay, let's fix this, was wrong. And so the first books about climate change by the serious people were, blaring the alarm, saying, everybody, we got to pay attention to this. And I kind of feel like, for me, this is a book like, everybody stop just banging on Trump. And in the UK, by the way, on Brexit, it's even worse than it is on Trump in the US, right? Their complete Brexit derangement syndrome is in like full effect. It's all people talk about all the time in the restaurants in London. Oh my God. But that doesn't mean you can't talk about solutions. It just means that the kind of solutions you're going to talk about will be experimental and they will be small ball. So in the last chapters of the book, I write about some of them. I talk about how in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University has engaged in these public-private partnerships together with local government and a lot of local businesses to try to bring in training and improve workforce so that you can bridge the town-gown divide in Baltimore. And it's been so successful that since I wrote the book, a number of other cities, smaller cities in the U.S. with universities have also started taking these on. Now, Finland had an experiment, a small ball experiment for universal basic income. Since I wrote the book, they canceled it. They decided not to fund it anymore. For example, Switzerland voted theirs down. There are some others that people are trying. There are in-betweeny kind of outcomes like gig economy in Denmark, where you have some towns saying, we're going to provide, it's going to make it easier for corporations to hire and fire people, no penalties around it, but the taxes are already really high. Here's what we're going to do for these people to strengthen their social safety net for the times that they're effectively fallow, to continually improve their schools. The CEO of AT&T is paying for universal training as long as their workers do it on their own time going forward. WeWork has some ideas around this as well, bringing in digital accounting. San Francisco, since I wrote the book, has decided to provide free community college education for all residents of the city that want it. If that works, maybe other cities will take it on. Steve Case, former CEO of AOL, has actually put together a relatively significant venture capital fund that's trying to invest purely in flyover places, so-called, because otherwise the entrepreneurs with cash never get there, and he's trying to show that that's a model that can work. Look, a lot of these will end up being like cold fusion, right? They will not be the solution. But some of them will be like solar, right, which today is cheaper than coal when the sun is out. And 10 years ago, no one would have said that. So I do believe that we are going to start seeing a profusion of experiments from good-thinking people who are frustrated that this is getting much worse and they don't want to live in a society like this. But I also think we need to understand that, unlike climate, this is coming much faster. It's much less well understood. And the people that are driving technology say it's going to be fine, and there is no reason to believe them. Mark Zuckerberg was in Congress doing wheelies around Senate a couple weeks ago, but he did say, look, I had no idea that we would be so divided on the back of some of the things that we're doing at Facebook. I believe him. I think he had no idea. I also think he could care less because it had nothing, because learning that would be opposed to his own model. Travis Kalanick, about 10 years ago, asked about AI and automation in driving, said, yeah, it's going to be hard. The world's a tough place, but the world doesn't always give you good solutions. He never answered like that again. He was trained to have much better answers after that. It didn't go well for him. I have no reason to believe that the CEOs that are driving AI really know that this is a fourth industrial revolution. This could truly be jobless. And if it ends up being jobless, if it ends up that we actually just need in 10 or 20 years' time radically less labor than we need right now, we're going to have to change the capitalist model. It's that simple.
It's interesting what you say, that these social contract innovations, to use the term that you use in the book and coming from its European origins, are being driven from local government up rather than national government down in this country and even in Europe, frankly, because that is where I presume the angst is felt and experienced first and most. Other questions? Lulu, please.
Thank you. Given the U.S.'s withdrawal from engagement with its allies in many parts of the world, there are many changes in power dynamics around the world. Looking at your very somber outlook, is there a more positive perspective in that could this new power structure evidence new leadership anywhere in the world that might be a leader who discovers their better angels and can find a way in which the vacuum left by the U.S. can have a positive outcome?
3 quick points. First is to go back to Kevin's close, where he talked about Japan, India, and China. It's precisely those countries that are embracing globalization with serious restrictions and caveats where we are actually seeing some of the strongest leaders come out right now. I do not think that is an accident. So I think Asia is a place where we're going to see a lot more leadership because that's where you have communities that are more oriented towards their political institutions as they exist. I mean, in Japan, Abe is not doing well right now on the back of all of these scandals, but the average Japanese feels as good about the Liberal Democratic Party or the Keidanren or the Keizai Doyukai as they did 30 years ago. Clearly not true in the United States, Europe, or Australia, New Zealand, right? So that's really interesting. And China, again, Kevin's point. India, Kevin's point. Second point would be we will see leaders that come out of untraditional places. The Pope. Catholic Church is a deeply sclerotic institution, anti-woman, anti-gay, anti-science, and yet Pope Francis, I'm a Catholic, Pope Francis, I think, is one of the most inspirational leaders in the world today. Why? Because he's authentic. Because he's talking about global issues, talking about poverty, talking about bridging divides in ways that our regular state leaders in the West aren't doing. And I think that turns a lot of people towards him. I think you look at how shambolic Theresa May's government is and all of the leaders in the UK are, and you're seeing a revival and support for the monarchy. And I was at the palace a week ago, and it was really interesting as they were asking me about prep for the Trump visit, and they're trying to give him a lot of time with the Queen and very little time with the public for they don't want to embarrass him. And I said, well, how does the Queen think about Trump? And she's like, she's seen 12 presidents. She'll see a 13th. And I think that, you know, in that, look, the royal family is self-acknowledged, not very bright. Clearly, they're not exactly representative. And yet the Queen represents something that really matters, I think, these days to the average Brit. And I think that, 10 years ago, you wouldn't have said that. Final point is that, you can get leadership in countries like the United States, but usually you get real leadership on the back of crisis. We're not experiencing a crisis right now. But if we were to experience a real crisis, the potential for the United States to turn out a real leader or more, I think, is not something that we should despair of.
I'm still struggling with the assault on the integrity of the royal family there. So,
I thought you were going to say the Catholic Church. I'm amazed at that.
Well, yeah, I've got these multiple loyalties, but I'm former Prime Minister of a constitutional monarchy. The Queen is my head of state. Fair point. It took serious talent to lose these colonies in the 1780s, but there you go. The next question up the front here, please. Yeah.
So, Bob Rosencrans, Intelligence Squared Debates. So, if you took a somewhat utopian view of a technological future in which we could enjoy material abundance with very little or much reduced labor input, what I mean, there is an example in the world that looks sort of like that, and it's the Emirates. And it's a pretty unhappy example. This is a more existential or philosophical question. What does a world look like where material abundance comes without much work?
If it comes with, it's a great question, and if it comes with our existing political system and social safety net, then it will end up with enormous numbers of people that are dehumanized. Because what will happen, right, in all of this abundance is that you're going to be changing people. Right? Within 30, 40 years, you're going to have people that are, very differently abled through technology, through the drugs they can take, through the enhancements they can have. We're already doing this with our military in the United States in ways that most people here are not aware of. Read up on DARPA if you don't know about this stuff, right? I mean, people that will not need to sleep as much to function well, people that will have highly, better memories, much more capable of doing the jobs that they're available to do. Those will be expensive. Those will not be available to everyone unless you have a social safety net that is very different than what we experience in the West right now. Now, look, we already have something like this on the planet. It's the way we treat animals, right? I mean, we love animals, right? And yet we've convinced ourselves that livestock are not conscious and don't feel pain. And we need to do that, because if you don't do that, it would be really hard for us to live as human beings, right, with the way we actually treat livestock, which is incredibly inhumane. And they are tasty, right? I mean, so I accept that, and look, and I don't care. No, we've gotten to the point that people that talk about people talk about animal rights in polite society are kind of a little fringe. They're a little weird. They're kind of too into it, right? Like, I mean, you're glad that they're there, but you don't really want them at your dinner parties, right? Because it's like, hey, we're going to serve normal food and we're going to wear leather and just go away. But the ability of human beings to support things, to internalize things, to vote for things that are really not okay is really high when we're not given other solutions. We find ways to tolerate the intolerable. And I really believe that for all of the utopian promise of technology, and that is the new religion. If anyone is developing a religion in the world today, it's Yuval Harari and Homo Deus and Elon Musk and the singularity with Ray Kurzweil, all these guys, and they are all guys, and that also tells us something. They're literally all guys. We should not believe that if technology takes away the jobs and creates abundance, that is going to be anything close to well distributed. There's no reason to believe that. There's every reason to believe that won't be true. Everything in human history, temperament, and genetic makeup tells you that won't happen. So that's why we need to address it now, when actually times are relatively flush and we have some cash. The Italians have just voted in a completely ridiculous group of people. They can't form a government, right? But if they do come in, or if they have a new election, which they probably will, and you get an even worse outcome, they'll be able to spend a lot of money. Because they've got a lot of money, because growth is picking up a little bit now. The Germans will give them some flexibility, right? That's the time that you want to try to say, okay, let's make sure that in all this money we're spending, let's do it in some ways that make some sense for the long term. Because the U.S. right now, that budget, a lot of money being spent, not a lot of smart money being spent. Not a lot of things that are going to address the concerns that you have.
We have time for a couple more questions. The lady there, and then the gentleman over here, if that's okay, and I'll just check on the time once we're through those two.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Nikita Desai from the Asia Foundation. When I see the title of your book, Us versus Them, I'm an immigrant. I came here in 1990 from India. And so I was a them, but now I am an us and a proud American citizen. So, I think when you said we're not at the crisis point when you were speaking, I really felt like we were at the crisis point. So what would a crisis point look like for you and the struggle for a lot of immigrants here in understanding what's happening with our country, which used to not be my country but is now my country?
It felt like a crisis in that regard for a few months when we had the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2009. 6 months later, it went away. No one cared about it. We didn't fix any of the issues, right? I think it feels more like a crisis when you go away from a presentation like this and then you go back to your jobs. You don't go back to normal, and we all will. This really doesn't impact us. There's an enormous amount of apathy and indifference to this issue. People are paying more attention. The Economist subscriptions are up. This is the first book I've ever done that's a bestseller. Right? It's not because it's so much better than previous books, because more people are reading about international affairs, right? And those are good things, but it's marginal. And so I really push back. As someone who's traveled all over the world, Kevin's traveled all over the world, I've seen what crisis actually looks like. This is not crisis.
I haven't been to Idaho.
You haven't?
No.
Really? You've never heard of the Great Potato Crisis?
No.
Really?
The gentleman over here for a question. Can someone tell me what the time is? I have neither a clock or a watch. Okay.
I'm Dr. Robert Lester. I'm a retired college professor from Nassau Community College. My question deals with an article in Foreign Affairs, the latest edition, written by Susan Lunds and Laura Tyson, where they would argue globalization is not in retreat, it's not a failure, and they insist that digital technology is saving globalization. And they believe the movement of data, I'm quoting from them, is already surpassing traditional trade as the connective tissue in the global economy, and that the past globalization was dominated by the West. Not anymore. Now it's going to be dominated by China, and the vortex of the globalization will be in the Far East, which will extend, of course, to Australia as well.
Which will be in part of China. Yeah, okay.
And according to the article, 42% of China's 42% of all e-commerce transactions. The trade and services are increasing. Digital platforms will make it easier for small business to reach customers. South and South trade is increasing. And AI will be dominated by China and the Far East, and that'll be the center of globalization. Doctor, did you read the article? Or Prime Minister, did you have a chance to read that article? Or I would like you both gentlemen to comment on that, please.
Over to Professor Bremmer.
With one small caveat, I think they're both right, 100%. They're economists. You will note that they talked about globalization. My book is not about globalization, but globalism. I actually say at the beginning of the book, I think that globalization has been a great success. It has taken billions of people out of poverty, particularly in Asia. And absolutely true that most trade is increasingly about data and services, which is not counted in, it's not NAFTA, for example. It's one of the reasons TPP was important. It was going to include that. It wasn't there. So absolutely true. The problem is that if globalization is working and picking up speed and increasingly dominated by Asia, but that a majority of the population of the West feels that the political ideology that went with globalization, globalism, does not work for them, you have a crisis. And crises frequently lead to wars. Now, I'm a political scientist, right? So the fact that the politics have not responded adequately to the successes and discontents of globalization, and those are not, by the way, just economic. We talked about culture, security, technology. Here's the place where I push back. They have no idea whether AI will be won by China or not. Right now, there are two countries in the world that are fighting a war over AI. It's the U.S. and China. There are a bunch of companies. Some of them are private sector U.S., some of them are state-supported in China. But I will tell you this. If the Chinese win the AI war, decidedly win it, that's probably the end of the liberal democratic model as a globally sustainable political ideology. I'm willing to say that.
That's a comforting conclusion. There's one gentleman there who I actually pointed to before. I don't wish to leave him out. And I'm glad you got your question, sir, but I was actually pointing to that gentleman behind you.
Hello, my name is Matthew Carpenter. My question is, you said you hinted on it a little bit while you're speaking. What is your analysis on the prospects of a second Trump presidency?
Well, he's 72, morbidly obese, and
the fittest president that we've seen, according to his medical report.
According to his own letter, yeah. And under a massive amount of stress. The job is hard. Obviously, the family's under a lot of pressure. and the home life is not great, he could die. So let's get out whatever the actuarial tables say. Let's discount it by that percentage, right? 5, 10, 20%. I don't know. Short of that, I think he's running again, overwhelmingly. And everyone I talk to in the administration, both active and senior that have left, will tell you that 100%. There's no way I think he doesn't run. And whether or not he wins depends on kind of two big things, right? One is, do the Democrats decide that their strategy is mostly just beat on Trump, which helps Trump if they do that, because it helps the Republicans stick around him. And secondly, who's the candidate the Democrats put forward? There's going to be at least 15 candidates on the Democratic side. Some will be very credible against Trump. Some will be much farther to the left. And the farther they are to the left, the better the shot Trump has to actually win, in my view. But you also have the potential of a candidate in the middle that's a really establishment candidate. And if they play the way Hillary did, that's a problem, too. I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to tell you is I don't pretend. Right? I thought Trump was going to lose the last election. And I thought it for some of the reasons that everyone did. I thought some of the reasons because, we didn't realize, for example, that Hispanics in the U.S. that speak English as a first language actually vote like white people. Polls just had that wrong. That surprised me. Cambridge Analytica and big data played more of a role than I would have expected. In swing states, that was interesting, too. But I think it is a mistake to believe that Trump is necessarily a one-term president. Right? I think it's very plausible that he could win a second term. And that's one of the reasons why I think people have to take this seriously. That if the response is just all the time on the media, CNN, MSNBC, all the rest, is just, look how much of an idiot Trump is. I got to tell you, everyone I grew up with in the projects is going to say, you see these guys? They're never going to get it. They don't care about us. And they're just going to turn out and vote for Trump again, just to spite him. Just to spite him.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had a genuine tour de force this morning. I think the questions about globalization and Ian's responses about it on the one hand and globalism on the other summarize almost the essence of the entire argument. Globalization, this phenomenal economic disruptive force which has generated such enormous wealth on the one hand, but on the other hand has effectively externalized the environmental first cost, the social cost and the political cost, and said that the political economy of all this is someone else's problem. Well, those chickens have come home to roost as we now deal with the politics and the political economy of globalism and try and find a third way through the middle of all of this. One of the other great quotes of Ian's in this book, he starts each chapter with a quote. I noticed you didn't quote me anywhere in this book, so the next volume maybe. It's a great one, though, here from Ralph Waldo Emerson. We learned geology the morning after the earthquake. And so in the identification of fault lines, which Ian goes on to in this book, it's a salutary moral tale to us all about becoming geologists before the event. And that's what this morning's discussion has been about. I'm pleased you met with the royal family recently in London, those who work for them. I assume a knighthood is on its way. Please thank Sir Ian Bremmer of Chelsea.